Well, I don't know about you, but I have yet to find anyone, young, old, or in between, who is willing to say 2020 has been a really normal kind of year. In fact, my guess is everyone we have talked with is eager to say that 2020 has been the strangest year in our own personal histories. We've experienced a global pandemic, a chaotic election, and a year without sports. We've experienced record highs on Wall Street at the same time businesses big and small are going to permanently close at a staggering pace. We have a year where both Easter and Christmas Eve services were held online. Now, for perspective, on 9/11 we mourned the loss of 2,977 people dead. And this past year, we have seen streaks of days when that many people or more were killed by COVID every day. It's been an unusual year. So most of us are more than willing to say goodbye and good riddance to 2020. It's been a year when many of us have struggled with despair and depressions. We hope that the new year will be much, much better. And in fact, we're kind of counting on it. Well, Isaiah was writing to the Hebrew people during 3 very difficult times in their history. His first 39 chapters were written to warn the people of Jerusalem and Judea to change their ways, or else God would allow the Babylonian army to come in and completely destroy their nation, completely destroy Jerusalem, and completely destroy the temple. And in addition, completely destroy their way of life. Feel familiar? The people did not change their ways. So Isaiah's chapters 40 through 55 were written to the people who had been exiled and imprisoned in Babylon. And the prophet wrote to offer a word of hope to the captives in the midst of their greatest loss and their greatest despair. Which brings us to the final chapters of Isaiah, which we're reading from today, chapters 55 through 66. And those were written to the captives who at long last, after 80 years of captivity, were returning home to Israel to rebuild the city of Jerusalem, to rebuild the temple, and to rebuild their way of life. The newly freed people, you can imagine the walk from Babylon, modern-day Iran, walking all the way, all those miles home, and all the while talking about how they would feel when they saw the hills of Jerusalem in front of them. You can imagine their anticipation as they walked the miles, and imagine how they would move back into their old homes and their old fields, how they would immediately get to work on the temple because that was so important, how they would start over again, kind of like we're talking about reopening churches and everything else. The newly freed people walked home with great joy and a mountain of faith because God had sent the Messiah, and in this case, King and General Cyrus of Persia. Yeah, that was the Messiah in the book of Isaiah. Cyrus had come to set them free. Well, the prophet Isaiah wrote to the people returning home because their arrival home was nothing like they expected. The city was in ruins. Nothing had changed with that. The people who had remained behind were not particularly happy to see the captives coming home again. And they certainly weren't eager to help rebuild the city. The captives' former family homes and lands were now occupied by new people. And they weren't willing to give everything back to the newly arrived returnees just because they came home and said, that used to be mine. Yeah, too bad. Nothing was going the way it was supposed to go. Nothing was going right. So in the midst of this, Isaiah wrote to say that the new city of Jerusalem would be a cause for rejoicing, that the nation of Israel would spring up like shoots in the garden when the warmth of spring comes. The temple would shine on the hill in Jerusalem as a dawn of new faith rose in the city. Other nations would see all the wonderful things going on in Israel and in Jerusalem, and the nation would become God's jewel of his creation, the diadem of his world. After 80 years of captivity, the faithful returned home only to find the place a complete and total mess. And at that point, I suspect it was hard for the faithful to listen to Isaiah's words of success, hope, and promise with much belief or much optimism. Even so, Isaiah wrote them 10 beautifully worded chapters filled with glowing words of hope and promise. And the returnees certainly echoed those words of hope when they were together, saying, yeah, it's going to be okay. But when they were talking to each other, I suspect their own speech was often filled with complaints. They wanted to build a new Jerusalem and a new temple, but in reality, they had all they could do to build homes for themselves and their families, and to start to plant gardens that would feed them once the food Cyrus sent, or King Darius of Persia had sent with them to sustain them while they were on the journey. The people returning to Jerusalem were eager to hear words of hope, but at the same time, they were more than eager to complain. They came home to their new lives filled with hope, but their new life was absolutely nothing like they expected it to be. The new people who returned to Israel were filled with gratitude to God for the opportunity to begin again, to begin a new life. They were also filled with complaints about what that new life turned out to be. And as a result of their complaining, they missed the opportunity to reflect on the past, to reflect on the years of captivity and what they had learned and what they had gained there, because what they had gained were the fully written first 5 books of the Bible, the Torah, that had been written while they were in captivity. They now had a record of everything they needed to move forward. They forgot that. They missed the opportunity to reflect on things that had gone so terribly wrong in the first place. They were so busy alternating between hopes and complaints, they missed the opportunity to grow in their thinking and grow in their faith. And if they had spent any time at all reflecting on the lessons they had learned rather than complaining, the returnees would have remembered that God had warned them to change their ways or bad things would happen. Rather than trusting false prophets and foreign powers to keep them safe, God had said, just trust me. Don't trust these other jokers. Trust me. Remember the covenant. I am your God. You are my people. But rather than caring solely for God and worshiping God, they trusted everything and everybody else. Rather than caring solely for the rich and powerful, God reminded the rich and the powerful to care for the widow, the orphan, and the stranger in their land. They forgot, in the midst of their complaining, how things had gone so wrong to begin with, and they missed the opportunity to fix it. Rather than learn from their past, the returnees complained, and the life they had hoped for in Jerusalem became a struggle that lasted for centuries. Rather than thanking God for seeing them through a time of captivity with words of gratitude, the returnees more or less ignored the new words of hope that God offered them. Like I said, I have yet to find anyone who is not happy to see 2020 in our rearview mirrors. And most of us are looking forward to the new year with the hope of beginning to live in a COVID-free world. Even so, experts are warning us to be patient because things will not change right away. We'll still need to engage in precautions that keep us and others safe. In fact, most experts are telling us that we're not going to be fully protected from the effects of COVID until the second half of 2021. So we're going to need patience and perseverance as we reopen and as we rebuild after the pandemic. Now, a lot of us, I have to admit, I'm one of them. I fall in the 1C category. I'm the second tier of geezer, as Gary Droman would say, to get the vaccine, and I'm pretty hopeful about that. But who knows how long it's going to take, and at what point will my feelings of hope turn into complaints about how long this is taking? And who's going first ahead of me, and why them and not me? And come on. What's wrong with the system? Something's got to be fixed here. You can picture it, can't you? Yeah. And my guess is it's not going to take long for words of hope that are coming with distribution of vaccines to be drowned out by complaints. I have no doubt I'll be in that line. If that happens, if If we allow ourselves to be overwhelmed by complaints, we will have missed the opportunity to reflect on what we learned from the year soon to be past. You see, as we begin this new year, we have the opportunity to reflect on how things got so bad to begin with. We have the opportunity to reflect on where was God's voice in the midst of the turmoil. What voices were we listening to? What voices were we trusting? And did the voices we listened to were they worthy of our trust? And what voices will we listen to keep us safe in the future? We have the opportunity to thank God for all the ways we were sustained through this past year. Because let's face it, like it or not, God gave us the miracle of technology. And that has kept us connected through worship. It's kept us connected with our friends and our families. It's kept us connected with the world. And we can learn to use that in new and exciting ways. God gave us our families and our faith family to be in contact when we were at our lowest points or when they were at their lowest points. God offered us words of hope through the voices in the Bible. God spoke to us in prayer. So we can take time to think about all the things that went wrong, or we can start to think about all of the things we have gained in this past year. All of the opportunities, all of the lessons, all of the things that we'll do differently in the future. So we can take time, I suggest that we take time to think about how we can offer hope to others as this new year begins. Because it's going to be a slow rollout, isn't it? I don't think it's going to be like standing in line for the polio vaccine, where you line up in the gym in the high school and wait your turn to get a sugar cube with a vaccine on it. I don't think it's going to happen like that. It's going to take time, and it's going to be messy. And in the midst of it, we need an Isaiah. And people of faith can be that Isaiah. We can be the prophet who speak the words of hope, who speak the words of patience, who speak the words of caution, who speak the words of courage, who speak the words of calm, who speak the words of optimism, who speak the words of God. We have the opportunity to be those people. How can we at Lakeshore be a beacon of God's hope to the world? What can we as a congregation do that will offer hope rather than complaints? Because as followers of Jesus, we have the opportunity to join in conversations, and instead of complaining, we can talk about what's the hope and what we learned from the past and all the ways and all the lessons and all the times God sustained us. Perhaps we can use our time and energy reaching out to others with hope instead of joining in the chorus of complaints. Like I said, I know I'm going to get impatient. I know that. I know myself well enough to know that. And I suspect I'm not the only one. And I suspect there will be times when we'll gather together to complain and say, what's going on? I thought these vaccines were available. Well, rather than be the complainers, we can talk about the process and about how fortunate we are that we have a vaccine available at all. Isaiah offered words of hope in the midst of a time of complaints, and when we ignore hope, nothing gets better. When we trust other voices more than God's voice, nothing gets better. When we do not learn from the past, nothing gets better. 2021 is just around the corner, and we can make it a year of hope and promise, or we can make it another year of complaining. Because, friends, hope makes all the difference. Amen.